Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 3, Episode 42. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Some additional reflections and comments on hashtag voteagainsttheincumbent. Things that came through me over the course of the last week that I do want to touch on, that I want to make clear before I make a social media blitz, perhaps even asking you, dear listener, for your input, for your thoughts, so that I could best communicate, to best package this idea in a format that I'm not that familiar with, that I don't navigate very well, the social medias, and reflections on Fargo Season 5, Episode 3. Absolutely brilliant television, absolutely brilliant storytelling. Excited to go through it with you. If you are new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, 5 stars, thumbs up. Please write a review if you have not yet done so. And if you are a longtime listener, I truly appreciate you. I appreciate your energy, your support, your patronage. And you say, I'm not patronizing your podcast. Well, you could solve that problem today. This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting. Let's do it.
Act 1, Additional Reflections on hashtag Vote Against the Incumbent.
Oh, I was excited this week to start doing some videos on the YouTube and on the Instagram about hashtag Vote Against the Incumbent.
Well, then I get all excited. I'm like JoJo, the idiot circus boy with a pretty new pet.
That's right. Squarely in my ego, I was ready to go out and take the world by storm with hashtag Vote Against the Incumbent, turning the entire U.S. political system on its head, saving democracy, and making, of course, myself famous. And that, dear listener, is when it came through me, it hit me, that I was doing this in my ego, that I had as a reward for the genius that is my solution, this bloodless coup to the stalemate we call democracy in the United States in the year of our Lord 2023. I had given over to my ego this, I'll use the word, divine inspiration on how we can actually solve the political quandary that we find ourselves in the 21st century. And in stepping back, I allowed myself to then feel into what was coming through me. Not so much that this is my baby, that this is some kind of inspiration that is my brainchild. Rather, it's a solution to a problem that is staring us all in the face. An analogy that came through me was a person that is overweight, that is unhealthy, that is taking medications because of their obesity, going into a McDonald's and getting the number 1 or the number 2. Now, I was going to actually look up what the number 1 or the number 2 was, because I haven't been in McDonald's for so long that I have no idea by picking a number out on their menu what you'd actually get. And then I thought to myself, I don't want to know what the number 1 is at McDonald's, and I don't want to know what the number 2 is at McDonald's. I know what their food products will do to you. I know that you will be forced into a number 1 and particularly a number 2, and neither one of those is going to be anything I want to associate with after having consumed McDonald's. So I'm just going to leave it to your imagination, and God bless you if it is your imagination, because if it's your knowledge, if I can say you go in and order the number 1 at McDonald's, or you go in and you order the number 2 at McDonald's, and you say, oh, I know exactly what that is. That's the quarter pounder with cheese, fries, and a Coke. I condemn you. Yes, I will sit in my ego for that. I condemn you, dear listener. How dare you know off the top of your head what a number 1 or a number 2 is at McDonald's? But I digress. So it's just as if someone who's morbidly obese goes to McDonald's and they order the number 1 or the number 2 at McDonald's, and then that faint voice in the back of their head says, you know what? You're obese. You're overweight, and you've got to do something about that. And they say to the person, the cashier at the counter, let's do the Diet Coke today. That's where I feel we find ourselves in our current political climate, in democracy in the 21st century in the United States of America. And as it appears, because I'm no expert, I do read, I do see that you have these problems in countries like England, France, Germany, even in Israel, this dichotomy that seems so entrenched in the political system and the solutions that seem so inadequate to solve such problems. The "I'll take the Diet Coke" while continuing to eat the fast food analogy, it's completely appropriate, and it leads me into additional reflections on hashtag vote against the incumbent. Two main reflections. The first being, I feel that we have the same type of addiction to this dichotomy, this separation in our political system that we do to sugary or salty foods, that we do to nicotine or caffeine, that we have with social media, that we have with our phones, that we have with pornography or video games or just television consumption, that many people have with their careers or with money, material possessions. We don't look at things that on their face might have a positive aspect to them as addictions. Yet they're addictions all the same. Within the last week to 10 days, I have read and or listened to material, content from Dr. Gabor Mate, the Canadian therapist that deals primarily with addicts. I probably butchered his name, but if you look up Gabor and then Mate, his name will pop up on the internets, as well as material from Dr. Joe Dispenza, each of them discussing addictions and how addictions manifest in practically every one of our lives. None of us are immune. Some addictions look positive on their exterior, addiction to a career, money, success. We lay people that are not in the social sciences, the psychological sciences, we don't encounter a lot of people who have achieved great success in business, in social media, in lucrative professional circumstances, people that have all the material wealth that you could imagine, and then have them articulate to us how unhappy they are. This is a open secret, I guess, because it's become more and more popularized by many of these doctors, many of these therapists, even these life coaches, people coming out on social media saying many of their best paying clients are people who have the means. They can pay for 100 counseling sessions with 100 different counselors. They're just not happy. They're continuing to look for happiness, and they're locked in to what they're doing, the person that they are, the person that built all of that success, all of that material wealth. Each of these doctors, Dr. Mate, Dr. Dispenza, articulates that there are addictions at play in these people's personality, in their psychology. And as a collective, I feel it came through me so strongly that we have a collective addiction. And it's not just in this country. It's not just in the United States. You see it all over the world, that there's a collective addiction right now to this separation, to this dichotomy. And I just said right now. I just noticed that I said right now, when in fact it very well may be that we've been addicted as people to this dichotomy for decades, for centuries, maybe even millennia. Thankfully, more and more people are waking up to it, and that inspires hope. Unfortunately, that hope is soon quashed with people's response to their waking up. They withdraw. Fewer and fewer people want to get involved in the political process, even to the extent that they just go out and vote. People don't want to vote. They feel like there's no one to vote for. I understand that completely. I felt that same way myself. And so what's come through me is to offer hashtag vote against the incumbent as the solution to what I perceive now as more an addiction. And like with any other addiction, the solution is going to be difficult. It's going to be extremely difficult for someone who's voted Republican all of their life. It's going to be extremely difficult for someone who's voted Democrat all of their life to then vote against the candidate that's a Democrat, that's a Republican, to vote against what they have perceived as what is righteous. What they were doing was righteous. There was righteousness in their position. So in proposing vote against the incumbent, hashtag vote against the incumbent as a movement on social media, instead of being so judgmental, I need to have compassion and sympathy for people who are locked into this self-destructive cycle of continuing to vote lockstep, up and down a ballot for the same party. That there has to be the same kind of sympathy for someone who's a heroin addict because they were in a very violent car accident or they had a violent injury playing a sporting event. This is no different than a woman who's suffered extreme emotional and physical trauma in an abusive relationship or been raped. And in order to separate herself from her thoughts, from that physical pain, has started to use drugs. It's no different than veterans coming back from these foreign wars with PTSD and getting lost in drugs to try to forget, to temporarily stop being that person who remembers. And it is no different than that morbidly obese person who has extreme self-esteem issues, that doesn't think that they're worthy and is eating themselves to death, trying to escape all of that pain, all of that insecurity, all of that lack, that feeling of unworthiness. I feel strongly, and maybe this is a controversial position, I feel strongly that our delusion, as I have previously put it, it really is more akin to an addiction, that we can't get out of this cycle, that it is part of the chemistry of our makeup, of our brain in particular, that we get locked into these positions and we feel like we are duty bound to vote for the people that we vote for, to support a party line, or even in some ways as independents to try to evaluate these candidates on the merits of what they're saying on a campaign trail, which, as we all know, is generally useless because candidates, no matter who they are or what party they're affiliated with, even if they're independent, are going to say what you want to hear in order to get your votes. It is a programmatic, a strategic and determined plan that will solve this problem. And instead of me going in and in a judgmental way, in an egoistic way, saying, this is what you idiots need to do, I mean, who wouldn't go up to the obese person in a McDonald's who is fighting through all of these health problems because of their obesity and say, hey, dumbass, drinking the diet soda with that terribly caloric meal with a bunch of foods that are completely processed and are injected with sugar and starch and salt, that's not going to work. The Diet Coke isn't going to work. It's just not good enough. All of us know this to be the case. Yet none of us will go up to that person and say it to their face, and there's a myriad of reasons why, and many of them are warranted. So if I go out and say as much on the internets, is that helpful? I'm struggling and yet searching for a strategy to present hashtag vote against the incumbent where people will see the wisdom of it, and if they don't, will be willing to engage in at least an exercise of questioning how it would work and whether or not it's been well enough vetted for them to participate. And I will say it again, I understand that the collective action problem is at play here, that everybody needs to have the confidence that everybody else is going to, quote unquote, hashtag vote against the incumbent in order for this to work. If you go and you vote against the incumbent and other people don't do it, well, what have you done? Not only have you sacrificed your vote, you may very well have put candidates into offices that you believe are very essential, that are at play for policies, for political movements that are very important to you, and you may have subverted those things that you believe in, naively thinking that everyone else was going to do something that you were willing to do in order for the betterment of the country. And it's the same collective action problem that kept a lot of dictators, that kept a lot of authoritarian figureheads in positions of power all over the world, particularly in the Middle East. Yet what did we see there? We saw the Arab Spring. It's the same collective action problem that's allowed people to basically make bets against companies in the stock market. And yet what did we see? We saw a movement where people went and hedged against those bets, and you saw the stock prices of a company like GameStop shoot up astronomically. Social media is the solution to the collective action problem. So I'm confident that if hashtag vote against the incumbent caught on, it could be the movement that we need in order to have the turnover of these political and bureaucratic stalwarts that have been in office for so long. And that leads me to my second point, my second reflection. Bureaucrats may feel threatened by hashtag vote against the incumbent. I have this strange feeling that politicians outwardly to the media would object to a vote against the incumbent type of movement, yet secretly, internally, behind closed doors, would celebrate it. Now, why do I say that? Many politicians have recently retired from office, and because they aren't going to run for office again, have candidly talked about some of the problems in Washington, of which there are many. But one of the things that came out that I thought was interesting was how much time that they had to spend every day fundraising. So to the extent that they ran on a platform and they actually got into office and they wanted to work on policy to make changes, whether it be domestically, abroad, whether it be in their state or nationwide, they didn't have a lot of time to work on those policies, to work on that actual legislation. Because most of the day, they're fundraising. They're trying to raise money, whether it be for their own campaign, the next election that they are going to be in, or whether, and this is more likely, they were raising money for the party. That's right. The Nancy Pelosi's of the world, the Chuck Schumers of the world, the Kevin McCarthy's of the world, the Mitch McConnell's of the world, these people are not master politicians, and that's the reason why they're in these seats of power. These people are master fundraisers. They are excellent fundraisers. Being able to bring in these vast sums of money and then being able to do what? To dole it out, to have the power to distribute it to not only your party, but to the members of the party. That's where the true power lies. And there are many people who went to Washington, D.C., and they got into that game and they realized this isn't really why I wanted to be here. Some stay, some leave. The ones that stay and the ones that can master that part of the game, they are the ones that hold the power. Now, dear listener, why do I go through such a recitation of what I believe to be the reality of the Washington, D.C., of the bureaucracy there, of the political climate there? The people who aren't in favor of, who do not enjoy, who in fact abhor or detest having to raise money for 4, 5, 6 hours out of every one of their days, they would welcome hashtag vote against the incumbent. Why? Why do I believe this? Because it would then focus their attention back to the people. They would have to respond to the demands of their constituents. That would be both their inward-facing and outward-facing persona. It's not just a mask that they would put on. It's not just some song and dance, a dog and pony show that they put on occasion to placate the rubes back in the hometown, the home state. No, they'd have to actually substantively start responding to the demands of their constituents. And although on the face of it, it would look like, okay, politicians would object to as much, secretly, I believe that they would support as much because there aren't that many Nancy Pelosi's. There aren't that many Kevin McCarthy's in Congress. Not everyone wants to ascend to that seat of power, knowing that in order to do so, not only do you have to dethrone the person who's already there, you're going to have to raise a hell of a lot of money in order to do it. It leads me back to a point I've made several times. I want to make it again. These politicians are not nearly the nefarious actors that we label them as. Is that the right way to say it? We paint the picture of the politician in such a negative light, yet they're just market actors. They're just responding to a marketplace that we as the voters create. When you can carve out voting districts with such precision that you were dissecting neighborhoods, that they looked like these weird scatterblob psychological pictures that people were being shown in the 1970s and asked, can you interpret what this is? And that was somehow supposed to be some insight into their psyche. When those shapes actually make up the voting districts, that's the real culprit. That we refuse to change who we vote for under any circumstance, that it is so predictable what areas will vote for what party that politicians can cut these places up and create a voting district that will ensure Party A or Party B is always going to win. That's the real problem, that there's no uncertainty in who people are going to vote for based on where they live. We, the people, need to interject that uncertainty so that politicians can't simply carve up, based on where you live, a voting district and say, this is definitely going to be a Republican district, this is definitely going to be a Democratic district. That's not on the politician. That is on us. That's like saying to a fisherman, don't go over to this fishing hole because there's lots of fish there, and that's not fair. I offer hashtag vote against the incumbent to the internets, to the social medias, to the voting, the political ethos. It is the health food restaurant next to the McDonald's. It is the choice for that obese, addicted person. And it's not me to criticize that person if they're not ready to go to the health food store. It's only going to hurt them. And I want to make this clear, both physically and psychologically. Yes, dear listener, I believe in my heart of hearts that this separation and this anger and this dichotomy is starting to create physical problems that are now being addressed by modern medicine with what, of course? Pills. Pills. I'm ready to get off of this merry-go-round. I'm ready to make changes, and I'm ready to do so in a practical and programmatic and strategic manner. Hashtag vote against the incumbent coming to a social media post near you.
Act 2 Reflections on Fargo Season 5, Episode 3.
That was an entertaining 48 minutes of television. Was it not, dear listener? So much to talk about, so little time. I debated which direction to go in for this segment, doing a scene-by-scene recap, talking about some of the major themes. What I want to focus on, the simple art of storytelling. The simple art of storytelling from a cinematic perspective. Telling stories through cinema, whether that be movies or television. Given a lot of the content that comes out on network television, given a lot of the content that's coming out of Hollywood, it doesn't seem that storytelling is one of the master crafts after 100 years of opportunity, 100 years of mistakes, of lessons learned. It seems like there's a regression in both television and in movies. The simple art of storytelling and how you can communicate and develop an overall story arc and the story arc of characters throughout the course of a 48-minute television program, and not do so deliberately, clumsily, to where the audience feels, even the dimmest among us, feels patronized. No, to do it in a way that subtly allows you to understand better the origin story, the development of a character, and that gives one this sense of familiarity, that we understand the characters even if we like or dislike them, even if we're rooting for them or against them. I spoke to this in some of the recaps that I did of the Better Call Saul episodes. This episode reminded me of the episodes that you had in some of my favorite shows, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, Game of Thrones. You have episodes that are payoff episodes where the exposition, the storyline, everything comes together and you have these major storylines culminating in some sort of action, some sort of incident within the universe of the show. So they're paying off all of the time that you put in, all of the character development, all of the story development. Yet how do you get there? You get there by developing a story in an episode such as episode 3 of Fargo season 5. This allowed the viewer into the world of many of the characters to better understand them, to get to know them, and did so in a way that advanced the storyline itself, which is one of the reasons why I love Noah Crawley, one of the reasons why I love the Coen brothers. This is how you tell a story. You don't hit us over the head with the backstory of any character. You don't hit us over the head with motivations, whether positive or negative, whether coming from this place of good or bad. You just allow the characters to breathe while advancing the story. One of the great examples of that being done in this episode is the storyline of Gator, the son of the sheriff. We start with this episode, Gator having to admit to his father, the sheriff, that their boy got killed, that Gator was sitting in the passenger seat after having gone to the bathroom and gotten some beef jerky and allowed this man to be killed, by whom? The guy that apparently, through the exposition between the characters, advancing the storyline, apparently this is a guy that Gator sourced, that Gator went and reached out to in order to bring back the sheriff's former wife. And now, subtly, we get more information between the dynamic of father and son. You can't be a winner, says the sheriff, if you just keep losing. That was a great line to help illustrate to us, the viewers, in the infancy of this season of Fargo. This is a guy who loves his son, and his son is a constant disappointment, and his son knows he's a constant disappointment, yet his son has the attitude, the bravado of someone who's putting on the skin of a winner. He doesn't have the inner confidence of past success. He doesn't have the inner confidence of knowing that he's a winner. He has to convince himself every day that he gets up and gets out of bed that he's a winner, and then he has to put on that persona, which is, of course, bravado, which is, of course, from a psychological standpoint, the first indication that this is an insecure person. So we go from the scene of Gator having to admit that he screwed up again, and it cost one of the sheriff's deputies, one of the sheriff's men, his life. I mean, the subtlety and the way it was done. You have both the hard-heartedness, you have the callousness, and yet the vulnerability of the situation in one line when John Hamm says to this Gator character, well, go and tell his fiance that he ran off the road. It was basically a single car accident. And you as the viewer realize that even if you think these people are the bad guys in the television program, that they have lives, that they have families, that they are in love, that they are pursuing the quote-unquote American dream. Switch then to the scene where Gator is having to pump himself up in the morning, getting out of bed to be Gator, to be the person that he thinks he needs to be in order to live up to his father's expectations. And then you see him going to the police station to steal the evidence that was found on the person of the second perp, the guy that he ended up hiring without knowing it, because he hires the Oli character. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but he has hired person A, who ends up getting person B to help him with this kidnapping, and he has to go and basically get rid of the evidence which will exculpate him as being part of that conspiracy, which he does. And then there's the encounter with the black police officer, the police officer that ended up getting shot in the firefight with the guy that he hired to do the kidnapping. The way this scene was constructed and acted out was perfect, was absolutely perfect. We get the sense that yes, Gator is an insecure person, and that he's trying to live up to an expectation that as of yet he has never been able to live up to. And yet you get a little bit of the insight into Gator himself being what? Very likely a racist. And I say very likely, I say that intentionally, because it is not hit you over the head racism as you see in this woke Hollywood environment in the 21st century. It's very subtle. It's played out not only in the interaction between the characters, but in the story that Gator tells about the last black guy that he encountered who tried to confront him. That story taking place years before on a high school football field. And then, of course, whether or not you believe it to be true, off the field, employing a tire iron. Fast forward again to Gator in the conversation with his father, after they have determined that there's an opportunity to have another shot at this kidnapping and assigning it to his son, not outsourcing it. He's going to assign it directly to his son, and he's asking his son whether or not he can do it. And you see, this is just brilliant the way the scene is played out between the actors. Joe Keery is Gator and John Hamm is Roy Tillman. You see in Gator this hesitation, this insecurity, and you also see the part of him that his father is most afraid of. The fact that the synapses don't fire that well, that he's not that bright a bulb. You see the John Hamm character as the sheriff as this embodiment of confidence and security, trying to pump up his son and try to get him motivated to accomplish this task with not the advice, but the direction. Competent people, people we can trust. Competent people, people we can trust. And then the scene of the four, right? This is Gator and the three accomplices that he decides to bring along in order to effectuate this kidnapping. Do they look competent? No, they don't. Do they look like people that one could trust? Not really. Does that have to be laid out for us as the viewers? Do we have to have someone come in and tell us as much? No. The story tells the story. We see that in the interaction of the characters, the way that the characters are interacting with one another. It has potential bungled operation written all over it from the start. And so that begs the question, if this is so important to John Hamm's character, the sheriff, the father, why is it that he will only entrust his son to get it done? And why is it that he does so knowing that his son has a track record of failure? I look forward to seeing that dynamic play out over the course of the story. And then we get the backstory of the sheriff, at least to the extent that it's being told from the time that and again, I'm going to call her our protagonist, that is Dot, the wife that has to run away from husband A to marry husband B and escape what is, I guess, a terrible, insufferable, perhaps even violent marriage. We don't have all the backstory of that. What we do have is the backstory of the sheriff, who's not only supporting one of these anti-government militias, is also married with two daughters to a new wife who looks to have the ideal relationship when you look at it from afar. Doting wife, big house, beautiful children, and doting wife in more ways than one. Not only will she put supper on the table for her husband and clean the plates, she will go to whatever lengths that he desires for sexual pleasure. And yet she is aware, because it's not subtle whatsoever, as he's lying in bed, he's completely obsessed with his first wife. And this story will likely play out over the course of the 7 episodes that we have left, the relationship that he has with his quote-unquote second wife. We don't know the dynamics of whether or not there's another relationship in between there. We know that he has what appears to be a wife. He's got 2 daughters, and yet he pines over this woman who is in Minnesota, he calls his wife, the one that ran away. How aware is she of his backstory? Does she know that he had a first wife, or the wife that ran away, when she met him? Did she know that in the grand scheme of things, she was always going to be number 2, the second fiddle? That has yet to be told. We don't know yet. I believe, though, that it will be a part of the storyline that will have to come to light in some regard, whether or not it's just we as the viewers finding out the nature of the relationship between these two, or whether or not the new wife discovers that there was a first wife and that in most regards he's still in love with that first wife. And how might that betrayal add to the culmination of this entire storyline? And I just said first wife. I can't say that with any conviction because Gator looks to be in his 20s, if not possibly late 20s, early 30s. So there very likely could have been a wife before Dot, and that would be Gator's mother. So Tillman could be on his 3rd marriage for all we know at this point in the story. Before we get to Ule, and I'm going to get to Ule, there's a lot of layers there. I absolutely love what they did with the backstory of the woman whose house he adopts. I don't think you could call it moving in. He essentially adopts or co-ops the house. Quick aside, I believe this is one of those types of storylines where we're never going to find out how he chose that house, how he came about or came upon that woman. What we do know is that she is a loner and that her life, told in that brief 2-minute segment before she discovers Ule in her home, that's enough time to create in our imagination a backstory for this woman that's better than most anything that you're going to get on an NCIS episode or one of these civil service shows, I guess they are, on Fox. You know, Fox Police, this city. Fox Fire Department, that city. The scene opens with this woman who is, I don't want to say fighting the Halloween crowd, but certainly it's on Halloween day, evening, night, and she's having to navigate all of the kids who are getting ready to go trick or treat. And what does she have from this escapade leaving her home? It starts out, at least in my mind, as here's this poor woman having to go out in this freezing weather just to get groceries, and she doesn't have anybody to help her, and she doesn't have anyone else to rely on in order to finish what is one of the things that we take for granted, being able to go out and buy food to sustain our lives. And yet what happens when she gets that wagon inside of her home? It's just 6-pack, 12-pack, 24-pack. It's case after case of beer. The woman just sits there in front of her television, drinking beer and doing what? I mean, what image did that conjure in your mind, dear listener? I sat there sympathetic and saddened that this is probably the life of many an elderly person in this country today, sitting around drinking with no one in their lives waiting to die, sitting in front of a television, not having anything else to do but drink and wait to die. Crowley was able to tell that story and tell it well within 120 or 180 seconds. And this is the perfect mark for this Ule character to happen upon in order to use her home as base camp to continue his pursuit of what he believes he's owed by Sheriff Roy Tillman and his son Gator. So let's start there with the Ule character. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, so be it. The similarities between this character, this Ule character, and the antagonist in No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh, it can't be ignored. And yes, you could say it's an homage, yet we find out that the Ule character has so much more of a dark and strange and mythological backstory. I'm not sure if Crowley's going to do this in different capacities throughout the course of this season. I commented on the last segment that the Kafkaesque moment was the whole Bisquick thing. The fact that you had Dot's character striking this chord with the Bisquick throughout the episodes. In this episode, we're getting more of perhaps what's a stronger through line about debts being owed and debts being paid. Now, in the first episode, you had Sheriff Roy Tillman speaking eloquently to the Ule character about the fact that this Dot woman, who we didn't know at the time was his former wife, and because she ran away, because she had made a promise, and he has this biblical libertarian interpretation of the world and the way it works, because she spoke the vows, made the oath, consecrated the pledge, and then left, there's a debt owed, and that debt has to be paid. And yet, here we see in episode 3, the debt that this Ule character took on and the money that was paid. The debt of his soul, his eternal soul, and he took this on. He took on the sin of this Lord, at least what appears to be a Lord, who committed sins, who there was some question as to whether or not this person was going to make it into heaven. So in this ritual, this Ule character is taking on this person's sin to ensure that they're going to make it through those hallowed gates, thereby what? Relinquishing his own soul, condemning his own soul. For what? A pittance in coins? Now, we don't know whether or not that Ulay in that iteration of his life was his regular life. In other words, I think there might be the possibility that he time traveled to that point in human history, that maybe we're going to see a scene that goes well beyond or well before the 1500s. Yet that might be his origin story, that as a poor outcast in this pagan environment in Wales that was framed in, or that had the cloak of Christianity, he engaged in this pagan ritual for money, and that damned his soul to eternal life. I don't know. We're going to find that out over the course, I'm sure, of the next 7 episodes, or we may not find it out. There may be different indications of what it all means, and it may be left up to us to interpret. The point being, the man was involved in this Faustian bargain where he is essentially trading his soul for these coins, the money for him to sustain his life, money so that he can continue to survive. And yet then we're put into this position where he involves himself in a pagan ritual, and you're not sure whether or not it's in real time or if it was contemporaneous to when he made that Faustian bargain in the first place. The main takeaway here is, even if it was a Faustian bargain, even if he did trade his soul to the devil for money, the money was paid. He did what he pledged to do. He followed through, and then he was paid for what he pledged to do. He was rewarded for following through. He got the benefit of the bargain. The consideration was tendered. If you were going to make a bargain with someone that has traded away their soul for money, remember the scene between Ulay and Tillman when he says, "I'm a nihilist. I don't believe in anything." And Tillman shoots back. He retorts, "You believe in money." And Ulay looks up at him. Yes, he may have sold his soul to the devil. He did so for money, and he would do it again. And this nihilism has condemned him to walk the earth for all eternity. Is it a possibility? That's my interpretation. That's what I feel like the storyline has laid out for us in but 3 short episodes. And, of course, with twists and turns, maybe there's going to be redemption. Maybe I'm completely wrong. That's where I feel like we're at. We're dealing with a soul that has given itself away for money. And if it has anything else to cling on to in this life, it's the benefit of the bargain. It's the consideration. I make a deal with you, I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain. If you lie to me about the nature of the deal, which is what Ulay claims when they're at the ranch, when they're in that corral, and he is essentially accusing the sheriff. Is it a woman? No. Is it a tiger? Yes. You didn't say tiger. I brought a guy because I thought woman. If you tell me tiger, it's probably another guy, if not more than one guy, and the price is different. Therefore, give me the money plus pain and suffering, and we can talk about a second attempt. Yet, deception, treachery. Ulay believes he held up his end of the bargain. Sheriff Tillman and his son, not so much. There is a resonance. There is a similarity between this Ulay character, the way that he sees the world, and the Anton Chigurh character from No Country for Old Men. When Chigurh finds out that I don't know what you'd call him, the bag man, the money man for the drug cartel, has put multiple people on the trail of the missing cash, and he goes and confronts him and kills him and has that soliloquy, if you will, in front of the accountant saying, you use the one tool. You make a deal, you get the right tool, you let the right tool go and do what it does and bring you back the money. You don't subvert the process by putting multiple people on it and thereby negating the deal. At least in the storyline of Anton Chigurh, in that universe, Chigurh, in my mind, always considered himself the scales of justice, being manifest in this world, that he was the one who was going to make these judgments, that he had the power then to effectuate punishment. And then you see in the end, many of the philosophies and the logic that he's employed throughout the course of the movie comes back to bite him in the ass. Will there be that similar karmic retribution for the Ule character in Fargo Season 5? Is his character not going to have the opportunity for redemption, whereby retribution, this karmic retribution, would be necessary? There may be a turn in the storyline where Ule gets to redeem himself. I haven't even gotten to Dot's mother-in-law, Lorraine Lyon, and her meeting with the local police. I'm not going to go so far as to say it was as brilliantly executed as all of the other scenes. It does give more of an overview into the psyche of this enormously wealthy person and the way that she sees many of the, let's just say, societal roles of what she considers the plebes, the plebeians, and what they're good for and what they're not. I actually think that plays into a lot of the stereotypes of the cold, wealthy people at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. Yet I thought it was well executed, well done, and I'm sure there's going to be, in some way, shape, or form, the comeuppance for Jennifer Jason Leigh's character down the road, as there always is in the Fargo universe. I'm looking at my notes, and could I go on? Yes, I could. Haven't even gotten to the montage with Prodigy, Smack My Bitch Up, where they're all getting ready for what is going to be the payoff of the next kidnapping attempt. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant storytelling. Am I at now roughly 45 minutes of content into this one podcast? Yes, I am. Am I going to have to edit all of this in the next 48 hours? Yes, I am. Am I going to conclude it right here? Yes, I am. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.